Ahead. All right, so we are ready to go. So I have my bloom pattern and I'm going to follow the instructions on page 3 for cutting my V unit. I have my paper plate ready, which what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare as I cut my V block unit with the instructions on my plate and lay as I cut each of the strips or squares onto my plate, and then I'll go and do my subcutting. This allows me to cross-check and make sure that I understand what I'm cutting, and it also allows me to set up my plates that if I only have time in the evening to work on one unit, all the information I need is on this one plate, which keeps me going. So my first cut is going to be my background centers, and I need to cut 4 width of fabric strips at 4 inches for the throw size. So I'm going to go ahead and set up my cutting here. I have my long ruler and I'm going to use the lines on my ruler. I'm not paying any attention at all to the lines on my mat. And I have my fabric here that's nicely folded and easy for me to work with. So I'm going to square up my strip, even though I know I started with the fold. And I'm a lefty by nature, so I can go ahead and clean this up without turning my fabric. Many of you will need to turn it. And then I'm going to go ahead and line up my 4. I'm going to take the time to make sure that I'm lining up one of the lines with the bottom of my strip, and I'm going to look all the way up. That's why the waist high table is most important, to make sure that my 4 inches is going the length. I have my 4 inches lined up, and I've double checked this whole length, and it's lined up perfect. So I'm going to take my rotary, I'm going to keep it straight. People have a tendency of turning their ruler in, thinking they're getting below, closer to their cut, closer to the ruler, when actually when you turn the rotary, you are actually going underneath the ruler, making what's underneath the ruler smaller than it should be. So always keep your rotary straight up and down. And we're going to go ahead and cut. If you need to, go ahead and crawl up and get your full width of fabric cut. Get your full width of fabric cut. And it comes off nice and neat. And then you're going to go ahead and line up your next unit, your next strip, making sure that once again you're double checking the full length. Again, having that waist high allows you to bend over and to be able to see your full ruler, and make sure that you can line up perfect for the full strip. So you're lining up here on the bottom as well as the full strip. And I'm going to go ahead and keep making my cuts. All right, now that we have our background cut and is on our plate, we're going to go ahead and cut some of our fat quarters. And again, I need 2 half width of fabric cuts this time because I'm doing the throw size, both at 4 inches. So I'm going to go ahead and line up and clean up my edge. And then I'm going to line up the 4 inches. Now, if you had something that was smaller than, say, 3 inches, I would go ahead and do a double ruler at that point. Because, say, it's 2 inches and I only have 2 inches under my ruler, I would go ahead and line this up to make sure that I have a longer edge to make sure I'm lining things up straight. So again, lining that up and then this ruler up to make sure that, in addition to, if I were doing 2 inches, I'd have the 8.5 plus the 2 to make sure I was staying straight. This is only 4, so it's really not needed, but I'm still able to make better cuts if I do it. And then I pull this aside to go ahead and make my 4-inch cut. There we go. And then I'm going to go ahead and make my other 4-inch cut. Sorry, my mat here I think is seen better days. So I then have my two 4-inch cuts. So I'm going to go ahead and continue making my cuts on my fat quarters so that we can get started on doing our subcuts for our V blocks. Okay, so now we have for our V block, we have our fat quarters cut for our 4-inch strips and our background cut for our 4-inch strips. So now it's time to do our subcuts. So I'm going to refer in my booklet to the proper page, and it tells you that right where you're cutting. So it tells me to go ahead to page 7 to go ahead and do my step-by-step center. Now, when Deb Tucker, who designed these rulers, came out with it, she has you, or in her instructions, I should say, she has you folding to make your first cut for your centers. So these are going to be the centers of our stars. However, I have found that when I do that, even if I'm very careful and move the dotted line to the edge, because that's the line I'm going to use, I find that I end up getting a very large fold. So not exactly as pointy as I want. So I actually go ahead and open up my strip to do my first cut. And what I do is I take the dotted line, because that's the line we're going to be using. So when we cut our centers, our fold line for our center triangles, we use the dotted line, and then you're going to use the proper size line according to your pattern to line up on the bottom of your strip. Instead of putting this dotted line on the fold, what I do is I move it over and I clear, I will actually first make a nice clean cut to take off my salvage. I'm using a white on white batik here, so it's not as noticeable. And then I go ahead and line up my dotted line with the edge of that to get my very first cut. And I'm lining up, in my case, the 3-inch finish unit on the bottom, and go ahead and cutting. All right. This is waist, no matter if we started with a fold or we didn't start with a fold. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to flip our strip. And this is, to date, the only tool that you actually flip your strip. Most of the time you're rotating it or moving your ruler. Next, I'm going to use the center triangle trim line that comes off the point and line that up with my just cut edge, lining up my 3-inch finish on the bottom. And I'm going to cut. There's my first two. So I'm a firm believer of touch it once. So I know that this is white on white at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and flip my white on white both so right sides are up. And I'm going to go ahead and start stacking them in the middle of my plate. I'm then going to come back and flip my strip. And I'm now going to line up again that just cut line with the center triangle trim line, making sure that I line up my 3-inch finish at the same time and go ahead and do my next cut. I'm going to continue doing that. So again, opening up both right sides up. I'm going to continue flipping my strip and making my way down my strip. All right, so now we're ready for our side triangles. So for our side triangles, we need to cut 8 pair. So when cutting pairs, you always want to fold your fabric. Now when working with fat quarters, I fold my fabric so that I'm slightly offset and clear the salvage. And then I'm just going to go ahead and clean up that line. So the raw edge that was the half of the fat quarter, I'm lining that up with the edge, cutting a clean edge with the salvage. All right. Next, I'm going to take the bold line. So the fold line for center triangles was our dotted line. And now we're going to use our cut line for side triangles, which is bold. side triangles bold. So I'm going to go ahead and line up my bold line just on top of the edge that I just cut and the 3-inch finish. And I'm going to cut. I'm going to pull those aside. And I'm going to go ahead and turn my ruler 180 degrees. Now there's a second line that says side triangles trim 2, and that is going to be placed on the bottom of my strip and line up with the edge I just cut. And I'm going to cut. This mat, I think, is giving me trouble since I just put on a mat of bleed. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and open this up and place them on either side. So I have a left-hand side and a right-hand side, and these should form a square. You don't want to do a UFO. You're basically putting long sides together, the long angle, or you can look at it that it's short, and wide, short, wide, but basically it's going to form a square. Now, if you're left-handed, you are basically going to work with the ruler upside down, and you are going to place your bold line on the left side of your strip, lining up the 3-inch finish on the top of your strip, and then you are going to cut. And then you're going to rotate the ruler 180 degrees. And now you're lining up the 2-inch side triangle trim 2 line with the top of your strip and going ahead and cutting. Either way, if you're right or left-handed, you want to open these up as you cut them, and you just need 8 pair. So you're going to go ahead and continue until you have 8 pair cut. So I now have 6. And so I can't get, in most fabric, another set out of this remnant, which is why I had you cut 2. But don't worry, we're going to use the remnant of this, if you're doing the throw, for another unit. So I'm going to go ahead and cut my last 2 pairs. Flip it around. And then I have my last 2 pairs done and set them up. So I'm going to go ahead and continue cutting my units until I have enough for my V-blocks. Okay, now we're ready to cut the other unit that's in the quilt. And that is a squared unit. You're going to make numerous of these. We have them in the center of our V-star. We have them in our 5 diamonds. So there's going to be numerous combinations. So our bloom, we have a bloom center with our accent fabric and our assorted brights, our accent 3. And then we're going to make 2 other units with it as part of our 5 diamond. So when you're cutting, you want to just cut the strip in the instructions. So I actually will have my center strips, in this case are 2 3/4 for the size I'm doing. And since I'm doing the throw, I'm going to use my remnant for that bloom center. Then I'm going to cut for the petal square, and I'm also going to cut for the star point square, and then the diamond center. The only difference is which fabric is in which place, so it's very important to pay attention to that. I'm going to take you through the cutting of the bloom center square, which will be repeated, which is different fabric in different places for the rest of your units. So I have my remnants for my side triangles, and because I'm doing the throw, you would have another strip if you were doing the other. And then I have my 2 3/4 cut for the center. All right, and I have all that on my paper plate. So I'm going to take my strip for my center, which in this case is my accent 3. I'm using this fabulous little dot. I'm going to take my square, and there's 2 sections on the square. Let me see here if I can hold this up for you. There's the section here at the top, which has the size chart that shows you the width that we cut our strips, and it's telling us the center square for a particular size. And that's what we're going to use to cut our strips. We'll use this side, this lower side, once we make our units, which will be in a couple weeks. But for now, we're going to use this size. So for me, I'm cutting the perfect square for a 3-inch finish unit. Some of you might be doing a 4, some of you might be doing a 5. So I'm going to go ahead and use a line on my ruler to clean up my edge. Now, Jeb was ingenious here. She has taken and figured out what size unit we need. It's a funky measurement. It actually ends in like a 1/16 inch measurement. So she has had us cut an oversized strip. I pay attention to her instructions. That's the size chart that I use when writing my patterns. And then we're going to cut it down to size using her ruler. So we're not trying to find a 1/16 of an inch on a main ruler. We're just going to find it here on the ruler. So for me, it's the center square for a 3-inch finish. I'm going to go ahead and line up my just cut edge with the outside and my 3-inch finish on the bottom. And I'm going to go ahead and cut and then tug it away and give it a haircut. So come across the top. So yes, you will have fabric that will be coming off the top that is technically waste or scratch. All right. If you are left-handed, I find for me, it works best to actually turn my strip around, and I actually turn my ruler over, or excuse me, 90 degrees, and I'm going to line it up with the right side of the strip and on the bottom, and I'm going to go ahead and cut. I thought it was my mat, but maybe it is my brand new blade. And then cut to get my perfectly sized centers. So you're going to keep cutting those. So remember, anytime you're cutting a squared center unit, you are going to cut an oversized strip and then trim it to perfection using your square ruler. Now the side triangles are really simple. You're just basically cutting them into 2 3/4 squares and cutting them diagonally in half. However, if you start it with, if you're doing the throw, then you have a 4-inch strip here that's a remnant. After you've cut your 8 pair of side triangles, that's when you're going to want to use this, and you're going to trim it to 2 3/4. All right. So I'm going to take my 4-inch strip, go ahead and cut it on put it on a fold, line it up nicely, and I'm going to go ahead and cut it down to 2 3/4. All right. And then I'm going to go ahead and cut it into smaller units, 2 3/4. If you have a tucker trimmer too, it works great here to actually do your subcuts. The Tucker Trimmer 2 is quarters and 3/4. So it works really nicely, but I'm going to go ahead and cut my 2 3/4. Oops. All right, and you're going to go ahead and cut 4 of those. So I just did that. And then I'm going to cut this in half to make my half square triangles. So I go ahead and leave them on the mat and cut. I know I'm ambidextrous and you all will be going through and doing, rotating your ruler. But then I've made my cuts. I go ahead and I'm going to line them up in my center plate. So you'll have cut many more of your accent 3, 16 to be exact. And then you're going to cut 4 squares, cut them in half, because basically you're going to be making 2 of these for every one of your brights, your 8 brights. And I go ahead and I always try and set up what that unit is going to look like in the quilt. I try and stage that on my paper plate so it's easy for me to identify. So you're going to continue on cutting for the rest of your V blocks, all the different types of squares. If you want to hold off and not cut your side triangles and your piano keys, that's perfectly fine. I'll cover them in more detail. So I hope you enjoyed today's lesson, and I hope you've picked up some really, really good tips. Thank you. Thank you very much for tuning in.